Saludos a toda la afición de Lucha Libre Online. Este que les habla es Michael Morales Torres, integrante del equipo de Lucha Libre Online. Y nuestro invitado de lujo en la noche de hoy, directamente desde Ottawa, Canadá, para el mundo. Gente, uno de los dueños de uno de los canales de YouTube más exitosos, actualmente el canal más grande de Canadá de YouTube, ex luchador que pasó por las filas de IWA, pasó por las filas de WWC, tocó las filas de WWE, tocó las filas de TNA de igual manera. Hannibal llega aquí por primera vez a Lucha Libre Online. Hannibal, man, it is an honor for us to have you as our guest. How are you doing today?
Very good, thank you. I think I understood some of that back from when I lived there, but I used to have a lot of translators.
Yeah, that definitely helps. Let's start by that. I mean, you have a beginning of your career, but I want to touch that first. Like, you wrestled in Puerto Rico, so how does a 6'4", almost 300 pounds Canadian ended up living in one of the roughest place on earth while doing what he did for a living, which is wrestling?
I actually loved it there overall. What happened was Bushwhacker Luke was one of the bookers, and he's the one that brought me over, and he actually gave me the name Hannibal when I came to Puerto Rico. So that's how I got brought there. And then had a good time in IWA, lived in Carolina when I was in IWA. And then I had a better offer to go to WWC. And when I worked in WWC, I lived in Levittown. And eventually Carlos, even though I was tag team champions twice, the only time we lost it the first time was because he was so behind on pay that I said I was going to have to go. And then the night that we lost it, he caught up on some of it and convinced me to stay. And then the same thing happened again. And unfortunately, I couldn't stay, but I did love my time there. I liked the island, the weather, I liked the gyms. And yeah, I actually had a fiance from Puerto Rico for a while too.
That's awesome, man. Not the low paying part, but the part that you actually enjoy the island. Let's talk about IWA. IWA was a huge phenomenon in Puerto Rico. The basketball courts, the arenas were always full. People were, man, they were hardcore, like back in the 80s when people threw D batteries or spark plugs or everything. They did that as well on IWA. So what do you recall of your experience working with Sabio, with Miguel Perez, with Castillo, with Bushwhacker Luke, Dutch Mantel, among many others?
Yeah, and Invader was there too. It was good. I never had any issues in IWA. I remember feuding with Ricky Banderas, which was pretty cool. And then Thunder and Lightning when I was tag team with Mr. Big. The arenas were packed at that time. It was 2005. It was before things started to fall. The fans were really loud. They reacted to everything. Yeah, you were hated. I remember when I would go to malls and stuff, getting weird looks, and some people like looked afraid and stuff, but it was a good experience overall in IWA. They were honest people, but I was working out at the same gym that Eddie Colon trained at the time in Orlando, Cologne. So I was friends with them the whole time I was in IWA. I was actually better friends. I would say the difference between IWA and WWC, the dressing room was not as close in IWA. Maybe that's because there was never any pay issues. I don't know. But it seemed like in IWA, like everyone was more business, where WWC, everyone was friends. So that was the main difference I noticed. But IWA was great. Nothing negative to say about my time there. I enjoyed it all. It was a lot of fun.
You had the opportunity, as mentioned previously in this interview, to go to the other side, which is known as the University of Pro Wrestling in Puerto Rico, WWC, and work for Carlos Colon Sr. as well as Victor Joica. How was your experience working with, besides the payment part, that's a classic here, but how was your experience working with them?
As I said, I enjoyed the matches. I think I wrestled Eddie in Orlando the most, probably. And then Black Pain and I were tag team champions twice. We again, Thunder and Lightning came over and we feuded with them a lot of the time. I liked it. The crowds weren't quite as good as IWA by that time. WWC, I guess IWA had started to come down a bit, but WWC was still lower than them, but it hadn't. It was still pretty good for the big shows. I remember they did the Carolina basketball court there a couple times. They had pretty good crowds. Yeah. And in Bayamon, a bunch of the times it was full. Not every single time like IWA, but the crowds were good. I have nothing really bad. It was frustrating because I liked it there so much, but unfortunately you need money to survive. But other than that, I liked it. We even went to the Dominican once with WWC. That was a bad experience. They on the way over there, for some reason, they didn't have us in the main cabins. They had us in like the workers' cabins where there was no air conditioning, and like there was no like real way to get food or water. So I remember everyone was really mad by the time they got to the Dominican because the trip there was terrible. And then the crowd that they had there, they were expecting it to be huge. And I think they only had about 400 people. But the way back, they did have us in the real cabins, at least. But I just remember the trip there was brutal.
How was working with a giant like Black Pain? He eventually went to WWE, but you had the opportunity to conquer the tag team titles, I believe, 2 times in WWC with him. How was working with him and bonding with him in the wrestling industry?
It was interesting because at that time he didn't speak any English. I know he speaks it now, but I would still say he's my best tag team partner I ever had. And I liked that tag team. I actually think if they had brought that team to WWE, we could have been a force in the WWE. But for whatever reason, that didn't happen. He got signed later. And we'll talk about my thing later, but I think if they had brought us together, that would have been a great team that would have got over because he was the monster. I was big too, but I could still take the bumps and like do some stuff that he couldn't do at whatever size he is. I forget if he's 6'6", 6'7", well over 300 pounds, but I thought it was a good team. And I think Chaparro was managing us for most of that, and he worked as a good manager. And yeah, I enjoyed the matches with Thunder and Lightning. I always liked being in the ring with them.
Let's talk about WWE as well. You had the opportunity to work with them. I believe you signed a contract with Deep South Wrestling, which I've heard the good, the bad, and the ugly of this territory. Some people liked it, some people didn't. Let's talk a little bit about your experience working with WWE. Who approached you initially and how you got to the company?
Actually, Deep South was still when I was in WWC. How I initially got into it was 2004. They started bringing me back for tryout matches. This was before they really did the tryouts like they do now. You'd be sent backstage. Some days they'd bring you in and you'd be paid, but you wouldn't do anything. And other days you would get matches. So I did get matches against Eugene and Heidenreich. And then at one point it was suggested to me to do a tryout with Deep South and wrestle there without a contract. So when I was living in Puerto Rico, I went there for a month, passed the tryout, and just wrestled there without a contract for a month. But because I wasn't getting paid, I couldn't keep that up. And there was weird stuff going on there. Then I've told the story a bunch of times with that incident with Luke Gallows and Zack Ryder, where Gallows was naked in the ring and Bill DeMott was holding the jelly donuts on Zack Ryder's face, getting Gallows to like crush the donuts on his face, and Gallows only had his hand like this on his dick to cover it, and everyone was watching. And it was around that time I'm like, I don't think I'm going to learn anything further here. I miss Puerto Rico. I'm just going to go back to Puerto Rico. And then it was after I was done in Puerto Rico that I actually was brought for a week-long tryout when they started doing those. And I was signed from that. But unfortunately, when I actually was signed to my real contract, that is when I found out. At that time, I've been cured since, that I had Hep C. So not only did I find out that I had it, but I also found out at the same time I lost my contract, which at that point I had been wrestling for 8 years. And like, as you said, I wrestled in Puerto Rico, Canada, the United Kingdom. I had paid my dues. I hadn't really made any money. So it was like my world fell apart at that point. But I eventually got cured, and thank God I was able to get cured. And it was found in court in both Canada and the US that was given to me by Abdullah the Butcher, cutting me with an infected razor blade. He had known he had it for about 10 years, and he didn't have my permission to cut me with a razor blade. And because I was bleeding from myself, I was already bleeding. He just did it because he felt like it. So he cut himself, and then he cut me with the same blade. And we actually got it on tape. That was one of the things that helped us win in court. We both had the same type of Hep C. We got it on tape, and it's proven to be spread by sharing razor blades. It's never been, it is possible if two people are bleeding in a match, but blood is flowing outwards. The cuts usually aren't that big, but a razor blade sharing, just like needle sharing, is like one of the main ways of catching it. But even then, he was found guilty of negligence, assault, and battery. Negligence because he knew he had this disease, and he kept wrestling in bloody matches. And whether he knows he has it or not, sharing a razor blade, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that that's dangerous. And assault because he cut me without permission, and battery because it caused me harm. So we won. He never paid a cent out of it. The problem was we won in Canada first. And then it took 2 years to get the judgment endorsed in the US. And in that time, he transferred properties, which is actually called fraudulent conveyance. So now there's still an ongoing legal situation against him and the people that he fraudulently transferred the properties to. Because once you lose a court case, you can't just transfer your properties. But sadly, it all costs money, and like I probably won't ever end up with anything. And the only thing I did out of that was set the record straight, which I guess is worth it. But my legal fees cost me so much over the years. That legal situation started in 2009 with the first letters, and here we are in 2021. All these years later, I'm still getting legal bills related to that case. So that whole situation was a nightmare, but the important thing was I got cured out of it, and I turned stuff around. Now I got the Hannibal TV YouTube channel, and I'm making money as a reporter, and I have a successful wrestling company, Great North Wrestling.
Which leads me to my actual next point. You became a promoter in Canada when people thought that wrestling in Canada was in its worst point. What inspired you to do something different to the rest of the companies? Because Canada has always been a historical territory. You had the Rougeaus, you had the Hart as well, but you decided to start on your own. So why did you did that?
Well, yeah, as you mentioned, the Rougeaus and Harts, I actually was trained by both Jacques Rougeau and the Hart family. So I'm one of the lucky Canadians that was trained by both of the main Canadian families in wrestling. I started promoting when I was in Stampede Wrestling. because in those days the pay wasn't much. Sometimes we'd literally get a handful of change. At most, we would get $75. And I noticed Stampede was running a good amount then. They had Natalia, TJ, Davey Boy Smith Jr., Ted Hart, Rick Victor from the Ascension was also in it at that time. Johnny Devine, who had some success and impact. They weren't putting a lot of effort into promoting, and they had weekly events in Calgary. Then once or twice a month, they would do out of town shows. And I noticed when I would do the out of town shows, I wouldn't see any posters up in the towns, and the crowds were sometimes really bad, like 30 people. So I asked if I could promote an out of town show, and we made a deal. And when I promoted the out of town show with the split that we had, I think the first one I made something like $450.
Well,
so
nice.
Instead of just getting my little bit of wrestler pay, I made a good amount of money, and I actually brought a much better crowd in, so it was more fun to wrestle in front of a bigger crowd. So I did a bunch of those before I went to Puerto Rico. And then by the time I came back from Puerto Rico, Calgary, Stu Hart had died. The Calgary territory had pretty much stopped. Stampede wasn't running. So I moved back to this end of the country, which is a pretty good distance from Calgary. And at that time, as you said, there wasn't much going on for indies. There was nowhere to wrestle. And I had been wrestling in Puerto Rico, but the pay had dried up there. And at that point, I still wanted to continue wrestling. So I decided I would start promoting my own events. And it went well. The very first event I promoted, I had 4,000 people, which was one of my best crowds. Wow. But it was at a fair, and I had a lot of help with that. And then it just went on from there, doing my own events, learned some lessons along the way. But it's been successful overall. We've had so many wrestling stars come through Great North Wrestling: Sid, Nash, Terry Funk, Savio has been here, Carlito has been here, Gangrel, Kamala, so many. The list is huge. Demolition, Jim Neidhart, Greg Valentine, Coco Beware, the Honky Tonk Man, too many to even remember, Tommy Dreamer, Al Snow. So we've been pretty good. And so we've been running since 2007 now. The COVID situation is still pretty strict here. I know it's pretty strict in Puerto Rico too.
It is.
Where it's really difficult to promote events right now. We've tried to promote one a few months or last month, but they added a ton of restrictions, and I'm not going to do it again until they ease up restrictions.
Man,
but we will be back.
Where can people follow the contact of your wrestling company? I believe it is called Great North Wrestling, correct?
Yeah, it's called Great North Wrestling, and we post all of our events on our The Hannibal TV Facebook page now, which is at The Hannibal TV and YouTube channel. But if you go to thehannibaltv.com, it's all the links of where you could follow us on Instagram at The Hannibal TV, Facebook and YouTube. But YouTube is the best way to keep up with everything. But recently, as popular as we are on YouTube, we got about 200 million video views on YouTube now. Recently on Facebook, we've been getting more views on some videos than YouTube for whatever reason. So now I'm starting to post pretty much all of our videos on Facebook as well for that reason. But I'm really grateful to have the YouTube channel. Just a regular person that was like a bouncer and personal trainer, as well as a wrestler. So it's not like I have any extensive video editing background.
Let's talk about that, man. You created your own journalism empire your way. Like, you didn't have help from anyone. You created your own thing. Now you have over 290,000 subscribers along in YouTube. You have a lot of followers as well on Facebook. You have your following base on Instagram, Twitter. You're basically everywhere, your own website. What inspired you to do a change in your life and create your own project?
Well, I had been working with other videographers. I think my dog, who's in a lot of my videos, wants to say hello to you.
Hello.
But I had been working with other video people in the past and airing my content on their channels. And in 2013, one guy that I had been working with, I had recorded actually 3 shoot interviews. My first 3 real shoot interviews, one with Honky Tonk Man, which I think might be the highest hit shoot interview on YouTube. It has almost 4 million views for 3 hours. One with Billy Graham and one with Lanny Poffo. And this guy who I'd been working with didn't want to give me the footage. So, but he was posting clips of it online. And at that time, I didn't even know you could make money off of YouTube. Well, I had done those to make DVDs, and I couldn't figure out why he wouldn't just give me the footage that I had paid for, and I'd actually paid him to record and paid the content. Never got the Lanny one back because he refused to sign a statement for me saying that he had done that for me, which is to his detriment because those 2 interviews became hits, and that would have been Lanny's big interview that he would have been known for. And then he talked about the Stephanie McMahon Savage thing in there. He talked about so much, but I won't hold that a grudge too much about that. But what I'm saying is when I finally got all this footage back, it took a few years. I realized it's not that hard to just start your own YouTube channel. And originally I already had a lot of Great North Wrestling matches on tape. So I was just putting Great North Wrestling matches and I'd put those interviews up. And then I realized that the interviews overall were getting way more views than the matches. So I decided, okay, every time I do a match, I'm going to make a point of doing interviews with the person. Yeah. And oh, by the way, one guy I forgot to do that with was AJ Styles, who I'll just throw out here. I pinned him 2 times in one night, for anyone that doesn't know that, when he was New Japan champion. But yeah, so I started doing that. And then a couple times there was some news that came up. I've always followed the wrestling news. I've always been interested in it, more so actually than the actual products themselves lately. And there's a few news pieces that I just wanted to comment on. And I noticed those got really good views. So then I just started regularly talking about the news, and it just keeps growing and growing. Every year it's getting bigger. So I really appreciate everyone that subscribes to the Hannibal TV on YouTube, because now that's my main job. It has been since the pandemic. It's been my main job, which is great. I don't have to bounce for a living anymore, and I can be in the wrestling business without getting beat up, having my body beat on.
Man, that's incredible, the things you've accomplished in your career. Before we go to our last question, I want to say something in Spanish as well. Pueden seguir a Hannibal en todas sus redes sociales en un solo lugar, TheHannibalTV.com, TheHannibalTV.com. Ahí pueden encontrar el canal de YouTube, que es The Hannibal TV. Lo pueden encontrar también el Facebook, que es The Hannibal TV, Instagram como @TheHannibalTV y Twitter de igual forma aparece como The Hannibal TV. Lo pueden buscar todo ahí. Tiene shoot interviews, tiene videos de lucha. Derrotó a AJ Styles 2 veces en la misma noche cuando era el campeón. Tenía Pamper Wrestling. O sea, hay mucho pietaje que es oro puro. Échenle un ojo al canal, está excelente. Man, before we go to our last question, I wanted to thank you so much for your time, for the conversation. Last but not least, you've accomplished many things in your career, both inside the ring and outside the ring. Do you feel happy or accomplished with what you've got so far in your career? Do you feel that you needed to accomplish something more? Like, do you feel happy knowing that you were, you know, the Canadian kid that started watching wrestling at a young age, that got trained by the Hearts and the Rujos? Like, once you saw that, once you see that kid and you see the human you are today, do you feel happy with what you accomplish inside the industry?
Yes, for a long time, I was really after that whole contract getting rescinded and that whole Abdullah thing, I was really depressed because like my dream had always been to be a wrestler, and now I've found that I can be just as happy doing this in the wrestling industry as wrestling. And like if I finish a good interview, I know that you probably get this feeling sometimes too. You can come off of an interview and have a huge high just as if you finished a match and you've got a big pop from the crowd. Like if you interview someone you really looked up to. And that's another point, like I get to talk to people that I grew up idolizing as my job. So how many people can say that? And not only that, I'm now branching into MMA interviews and boxing interviews and UFO related interviews because I'm really interested in those domains. So my mind is more open now than when I was younger, when it was just, I want to wrestle and I'm not going to settle for anything but wrestling. I was on that type of mentality, and I'm glad I have this opportunity to do this now because it's very satisfying.
Man, amazing. Once again, thank you very much for your time. Always wishing you success in all your projects, your career, and your personal life, man. And let's wrap this up en español. Let's wrap this up in Spanish. Este fue Hannibal y Michael Morales Torres para Lucha Libre Online, la marca número 1 de Pro Wrestling y Combat Sports en español.